guys. It's Rene Rocha with Morgan & Morgan. Thanks for having us over here today, and thanks for coming. It's really an honor to speak to rooms like this and to speak with folks that have been affected by these kinds of disasters. And it's our job and our mission to try to help you and try to help get some answers as quickly as possible. So I'm sure you guys are all pretty intimately aware of what's happened here. So, we'll spend a little bit of time introducing ourselves and talking a bit about the incident, but would really like to spend most of the time here addressing your questions. So if you have them, look forward to hearing them. And if not, got some time to think about it while we're up here talking. So if we could go to the first slide here. Yep. So I work at our firm's environmental and toxic tort practice. I've been doing this for about 12 years and coordinate our firm's efforts in that area along with my partner, Frank Petosa. We work quite a bit with Robert Kennedy Jr., who's here with us today and is, I think, going to help really give a lot of perspective on what you guys are dealing with based on his decades of experience in this area, as well as my partner, Tim Fox, who's the former Attorney General of Montana, and he works in our governmental outreach practice, which I think is going to be really important here. There's a lot that the governments can do. There's a lot that they haven't done yet, and one of the things that Tim is a specialist in is liaising with governmental entities to try to help nudge them in the right direction. And I think he can also help provide some insight from his time as an elected official on how you guys can do that and talk to the elected officials who represent you and get them to do their job. In our practice, if we could go to the next slide, we've dealt with a number of disaster cases before. These are just some of the examples, but about 13 years ago now, the BP oil spill blew out a rig in the Gulf of Mexico that was uncontrolled for several months and spilled millions of pounds of crude oil into the Gulf of Mexico. I was involved in that case along with our firm in trying to get restitution for the people who were affected by that. It was a long, hard fight against nasty defendants, but in many ways their corporate conduct is very similar to the conduct that Norfolk Southern is displaying here. BP had this mentality and internal motto that they were just going to run it till it broke. They didn't care about equipment maintenance. They thought it was more worth their time and money to just break stuff instead of doing preventative measure because they cared about money a lot more than people's health and safety. And unfortunately, that seems to be how Norfolk Southern operates too. And just to get ahead of myself a little bit, like BP and some of these other defendants that we've dealt with, the arrogance from this company is just astounding to me. It's one thing to screw up so badly that we get to a situation like this to begin with, but then to continue to behave the way that they behaved afterwards, to me, is just insulting, and I can only imagine how it makes you guys feel. In Porter Ranch, that was another gas blowout, but this was natural gas. So where the BP oil spill was crude, liquid hydrocarbons, this was gaseous hydrocarbons. Similar issue though, they blew out their well that they were using to store this natural gas, and it spewed uncontrolled into this neighborhood for about 6 months before they could drill a relief well. People in that community had to be displaced from their homes for several months. They were dealing with a lot of symptoms and consequences of exposure. I don't think the consequences there are at the level that they are here, because the toxins here in this case are just of a whole nother nature, and we'll talk about that. But we were able to successfully litigate against the gas company and recently achieved a $1.8 billion settlement for the people in that community, for all the disruption that they had to suffer as a result of that. Another case with similarities to this one's the Merrimack Valley explosions in Massachusetts. So that was a community in the Massachusetts-New Hampshire border. And in that case, the utility company that was running gas lines to people's homes overpressurized their system and basically exploded 3 towns. So it was a complete disruption and disaster. One person died, several people were injured. Luckily, not as many as could have been. But those people were out of their homes for the winter, without heat, without hot water. It was a real mess for them. We were able to achieve a $143 million settlement for their disruption. Luckily for that community, they weren't exposed to anything toxic. So again, a little bit different than this, but some similarities in the disruption. And Tangelo Park is another interesting case that has some parallels here. That's a case we're currently litigating against Lockheed Martin. They have a factory where they build missiles in Orlando, and there's a community basically across a highway from there that for decades has had higher rates of death from cancer and central nervous system diseases. And of course, the Lockheed Martin facilities causing significant exposures in that community. And they would have you believe it's all just some giant coincidence that the people with those kinds of exposures are developing illnesses. And we think the judge understands that it's not, and is going to allow us to see a jury a few months from now. But we're really hotly litigating that one as we speak. But why it's relevant here is our experience in that case really helped us develop an intimate understanding of a lot of the kinds of exposures at play here. Vinyl chloride is a constituent in that case, and also understand not only the health impacts, but how it travels, what happens when it's ignited, what the proper way to remediate that would be. And the thing about vinyl chloride, as I'm sure you guys have heard, is that it's extremely persistent in the environment. So if you dump 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride into a ditch like this train company did, it's going to find its way into the groundwater. It's going to stay in the soil unless you excavate the soil, and it's going to stay in the groundwater unless you essentially suck it out of the groundwater. And what they're doing at that Lockheed Martin facility, they have these things called air strippers. So they basically suck the groundwater out, cause the vinyl chloride and other similar gaseous compounds to separate from the water and then pump the water back out. But the problem with how Lockheed's doing it is they're just shooting that vinyl chloride directly into the air. And when you do that, people are going to breathe it. And, I'm sure a lot of folks in this room have unfortunately had to breathe it from how Norfolk Southern handled themselves. But what they should have done, well, before I get to what they should have done, the remediation process is something we've got a lot of familiarity with. And what we found out from being on the ground just this past week is that they're essentially doing makeshift versions of that. I don't know that the government knows it. I don't know that anybody knows it, because it seems pretty shady how they're going about doing it. But there's a lot of this stuff still going into the creeks. My experts are telling me that the folks who are working for Norfolk Southern along these creeks are vomiting, they're sick. they're having a bad time. There may be some word that's going to get to the EPA about this from those people. But they're essentially doing the same thing. They're disturbing the creeks that they have polluted in order to cause the off-gassing of these compounds. When you do it like that, problem is, like with the Lockheed case in Tangelo Park, it's going into the air. And so, despite what these limited tests that have been waved around by Norfolk Southern and some governmental agencies would have you believe, I can guarantee you that your skin, your lips, your tongue, your lungs, your gastrointestinal systems are not deceiving you. You feel off, if you do feel off, because there are exposures happening. And what they're doing in the creeks is a continuous source of exposure. And we've got samples we pulled that we look forward to finding out more about. And I realize I neglected to mention something I intended to at the very outset, which is, if there's anybody here from Norfolk Southern or that's paid by Norfolk Southern, could you please identify yourself? Okay. Well, I hope that means there's no one here, but in case somebody's being forgetful, I would just emphasize that this is intended for residents who have questions and concerns. This is not a presentation intended for the train company, and I would ask you to leave if you've been paid by them to be here. So sorry for that digression. I just know how these companies can do. So to talk a little bit more about what's happened here, there was a big derailment about a month ago now, and really, you've got this quote here from the chair of the NTSB saying this was 100% preventable. And I don't think that really even scratches the surface of understanding the screw-ups on top of screw-ups on top of screw-ups that have to happen for something like this to get to the level that it did. Every single part in that chain was 100% preventable. The derailment itself was 100% preventable. This company is responsible for essentially all of the derailments in Ohio and Pennsylvania over the last couple of years. Something like 88 to 93%, depending on the state. And once the train goes off the tracks, and there's reasons why that happened. The NTSB is reporting on that and uncovering it. They basically had a wheel bearing that overheated through the axle and it went off the tracks. But when that happens, look, derailments, it's not the first train that's ever fallen off the tracks. There are ways to prevent the consequences of what ultimately ended up happening after that. The rail car should never have been breached. That integrity should have multiple layers of redundancy to prevent anything from seeping out. Double-walled tanker cars, there's a lot of things they could do, but they didn't because they like money more than people. And even once you have a breach, it wasn't the vinyl chloride cars that breached, it was other cars. And basically, that created a 1 million pound chemical fire that they couldn't put out, and led to further consequences. But again, all of that is foreseeable. This isn't some kind of freak event that nobody could have seen coming. So there are emergency relief valves that are on all these cars carrying combustible chemicals, including vinyl chloride. So now when you have the multiple failures to get to a 1 million pound chemical fire, there's one more. Those emergency relief valves failed. And they claim they were afraid that there was going to be a catastrophic explosion, which is certainly something that could happen if you get into that situation. But what's still unclear and to me a little bit suspicious is that the concern about the failing emergency relief valves was supposedly only from one car or a few cars. It was not for all of the vinyl chloride cars. Yet they chose to empty out all those cars and just light them on fire. Now, Bobby Kennedy can speak to this. He's been doing this a lot longer than I have, but I think they pulled a fast one here. And I can't imagine, just in the experience that I have, any regulator ever signing off on something like that outside of the panic and threat of an emergency situation. It's my belief they took advantage of that to get rid of what to them is a problem that would have taken a lot of time and money to deal with properly. But instead of taking care of their problem, they made it your problem. And that's just beyond the pale. And it's our mission and our cause to hold them accountable for it and make sure that this never happens again. I want to get to questions.
I just want to mention something.
Yes, sure, go ahead, sir.
Should I stand up or?
Whatever you want, yeah, sure, go ahead.
When I get back to what you were mentioning about, they mentioned about that the wheel was a problem. The stories that I heard, again, I'm going to call them stories because I don't know if they're fact-based, is that when the car was caught on fire 20 minutes before the actual accident. Now, the other thing that I had heard, again, this is, I would like you to verify it, because I had heard that the cars were overloaded when they came out of Indiana. Again, I don't know if that's true, but if that's true, that would obviously affect the derailment, because obviously if you're carrying extra weight, let's go by physics, that's going to cause, derailment also.
Yeah, and
Again, I'm not trying to, I'm not going to say verify these stories or not, but that's why I've heard that the cars were overloaded in Indiana.
yeah, I've
So
heard.
I think that was maybe, actually, what caused the derailment also.
Could be. I've heard of the fire before the derailment, but I hadn't heard of the overloading. But as I was saying to some other gentlemen that I met before we started talking up here, at this point, the way this company's acted, nothing would surprise me. And so we'll get to that information in discovery, which is the process of litigation where we get a subpoena from the court forcing them to give us the documents and records that they have that usually will shed some very poor light on how a company like this has behaved. If we could go to the next slide. We talked a little bit about this, and your question was a good segue to this and why nothing would really surprise me about this company. They were just running as lean and mean as they could. And like I said, it really evidences that all they care about is money. And look, I was raised growing up, going to church, knowing my neighbors, playing in the streets, and I've just never understood people that have that mentality where it's just about money. But that's how some companies act, and companies are made out of people. So ultimately, it's people acting like that too. And one of the things that we'd like to do, and it's going to be challenging with the state of Ohio law, but we're going to do our best to figure out a way, is not just to make you whole for everything that's happened, but to have punishment of this company and this behavior. So nobody's sitting in a room like this 5 years from now dealing with the same kind of thing in another community. So we can go to the next slide. This is just some description about what we've done and the kinds of damages we're seeking in our litigation process. There's a lot of particular ways that damages get characterized in a legal setting, but essentially any negative consequence that has happened to you as a result of this could potentially be something that could be remunerated in litigation. Now, there's a lot of technicalities into how that gets classified, how it gets paid back, but we take a broad approach to this. So, we got some questions ahead of time. It's not just the health issues, which are going to be a huge issue, and I'll get to that in a second, but the trauma, the pain and suffering. I know what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck and to be displaced from your home and not know if it's safe to be there, or to know you're being sick from being there and not really have a lot of money to go elsewhere. That's a harm in and of itself, and a harm that deserves compensation from our perspective. And we think that we'll have a good argument for the courts to have that be compensated. In some of the other cases that I put up there earlier, that is categories of damages that were compensated, and it's something that should never get overlooked. There's also people who have potential business interruption, lost property values. We know somebody who was planning to sell their home and retire, moved to Florida in April, and let's just say those plans have been changed. So there's a lot of ways that this has affected people, but one of the most concerning to me as an environmental litigator is the health issues. And there are short-term health issues, and I think we're probably getting to the point now where we shouldn't call it short-term anymore. We're a month out, and folks are still dealing with the consequences of exposure. And in my mind, as I mentioned earlier, there are ongoing exposures. So, there is certainly legal precedent that is compensable, but the more concerning issue is, what are the long-term impacts? And we have a really excellent team of experts that we're working with, that we've worked with in other litigations, including some of the ones we talked about earlier. But there's this one doctor runs a cancer research lab at Harvard University, who's going to help us explain to the courts, to a jury, and to Norfolk Southern, to the extent that they'll take the cotton out of their ears and hear it, the molecular changes that happen when you're exposed to chemicals like these, and what the consequences of those changes may be. I hope no one here gets seriously ill down the line, but it could happen. And part of the issue is that might not happen for many years. And one of the things we're trying to seek is a court-imposed medical monitoring program to make sure that anybody who might get sick can get diagnosed early when a disease may be in a treatable stage, when the worst consequences of developing that disease can be mitigated, and make sure that comes out of Norfolk Southern's pocket and not yours. And then down the line, if anything like that does happen, there may be further legal actions that you can bring for developing an illness like that may be latent for some years. In the next slide, and I forgot to mention, but I think we talked about it a little bit earlier. We've been taking samples all over, places where the railroad has led us, places where they don't know that we're taking it from. They've been tailing our people, but I think we've found some stuff that other folks aren't wise to yet, and hopefully will be very helpful in shedding a light on their ongoing bad conduct. This next slide is just kind of a further recitation of that. We're working with a lot of different experts. It's going to be a complex endeavor to recreate where the exposures have gone. And again, as you're already hearing from Norfolk Southern, their line's going to be that nobody's been exposed to everything, or nobody's been exposed to anything, which you know, there's some judges who might entertain an argument like that, but I don't think any jury's going to. And, you know, as I mentioned, we have experience going toe-to-toe with these kinds of bad actors. I talked about BP, I talked about some of the cases, some cases that weren't up there. I've litigated against Monsanto as Robert Kennedy and David Carpenter have as well. And they're about the nastiest company that you could imagine. I don't expect Norfolk Southern to be any different, but they'll throw everything at you. And if you don't have seasoned counsel who knows how to deal with it, it can be tough to get your day of justice. But I can tell you that we know how to deal with those kinds of companies, and we're ready to stand up to them. We enjoy it. We don't enjoy having to deal with the jerks that they throw up against us, but we like getting justice for people. And speaking of that, this next slide touches upon some issues that are going on out there. They've been offering these $1,000 payments to people. In a lot of these other cases, defendants have tried to get quick releases from folks that they've victimized. In essence, victimizing again after they victimize them by taking advantage of their need for quick cash. Because like I said, I remember what it's like to be out of my house and not really have a whole lot of money to make for alternative arrangements. And there's some folks who just need that money. But I would strongly, strongly encourage anybody in this room to talk to a lawyer. It doesn't have to be us, we'd be happy to do it, but talk to some lawyer before you sign anything. Because if you sign away your rights now, it could be very, very difficult or impossible to ultimately get the justice that you deserve. So please talk to folks in the legal community before you do anything, before you have any communication with Norfolk Southern. I mean, they're asking folks to give them their employment history, all sorts of personal information. This is not a company that can be trusted. If there's any doubt, and I doubt that there is a whole lot in this room, have a lawyer deal with it. Again, it doesn't have to be us, but it's important because they don't have your interests at heart.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Who gave the order to burn?
yeah, good question.
Norfolk Southern, I do not believe, has that authority. So the state of Ohio has to have some culpability in this.
Potentially. So let me tell you what I learned. I testified at a Senate hearing in Pennsylvania, right on the Pennsylvania side of the border. They had it in Beaver County Community College out in Monaco. So their Senate committee invited me to testify, but before my testimony, they had a panel of governmental agencies who were involved in the response, and they kind of raked them over the coals. But what the folks from those agencies said is not surprising and consistent with the suspicions I shared with you earlier, is that Norfolk Southern wouldn't talk to them. They said, we've got to do it, we've got to do it. These cars are going to blow up. They asked them if there are any alternatives. What else can you do besides this? They said, there are no alternatives, there's no time. We've been doing this for 200 years, trust us. So they basically said, my understanding is, they basically said, okay, we're not going to stop you, but they didn't order them to do it by any means. They were essentially, and pardon the pun, railroaded into letting them get away with that. And here's the problem. To do it the right way would have cost this company millions of dollars. So, you know, Mr. Kennedy can probably talk to this too. What they should have done is put it into a lined area contained with booms or earthen berms, and then remove that into a secure containment vessel. You know, the vinyl chloride got in those cars by somebody putting it in those cars. So just like you can put it in those cars, in that situation, you can put it into other rail cars or similar containment vessels. Now, they would have had to dispose of that off-site, certified toxic waste facility, which would have cost them a lot of money. What would have cost them even more money, they would have had to excavate all that soil. They would have had to do it under EPA's watch. Then they would have had to investigate the groundwater. Because like I said, those contaminants are gonna leach down. And removing it from groundwater can take decades. Costs a lot of money. But they didn't do that. They just took their problem and made it your problem and lit it on fire. And I think they used the guise of an emergency situation to get away with doing that, because outside of the threat of some cataclysmic event, I don't think there's anybody who would sign off on that. And you know, this might be a good time for me to introduce some of the other folks on our panel. Okay, sure.
With your legal fees for like a lawsuit and or class action lawsuit, how would that look like depending on the situation as opposed for something against?
Sure, and can you stand up and, yeah, I'm having a hard time seeing who's asking. Oh, hey.
So I was just curious for the legal fees in regards to maybe a lawsuit from an individual and or class action lawsuit. What would be, you know, I guess the fees or costs for Morgan to be involved in something like that?
Yeah, so I can tell you generally, there are two structures to that. And I've been given some guidance from, you know, folks who are familiar with the Ohio ethics rules, and they've cautioned me against getting too into detail about specific cases and specific legal issues. So I don't want to be up here giving legal advice. But generally, there are two ways that can be structured. And this is something we're talking about with other lawyers who are involved. Is this a class action case? Or is this a case where everybody should have their own standalone type of issue? Generally, what happens in a class action case is there's a court-appointed class counsel. It could be a firm or a group of law firms. And depending on the amount of effort that goes into class action resolution, the court will award fees based on that. In an individual action or a mass action, everybody has their own individual lawsuits. And that may be appropriate here. A class action may be appropriate here too. We'll see, and we're happy to talk to any of you guys about that on an individual basis if you hire us as your lawyers. But just in a general sense, in an individual case, everyone has their own case and their own attorney fee agreement that would govern the relationship with that regard. So, you know, there's different fees structures that get set up for different cases.
On top of that, if that's something that we want to talk about, do you believe in this case it would be more beneficial for everyone to have their own or class action for getting the results?
Yeah, and now, so that's straying into the realm of specific legal advice, so I shouldn't be up here on a podium saying that, but I can honestly tell you it's something that we're still grappling with. You know, it's not clear cut, but I think, look, we've been involved in cases where it's done simultaneously both ways. The BP oil spill, Porter Ranch, those cases both had components of class actions and mass individualized actions. So ultimately, for a plaintiff, it doesn't necessarily differ a whole lot in experience. But anyway, I don't want to get too into the weeds on that stuff right now. So I think what might make sense is for me to introduce Dr. David Carpenter. He's a toxicologist with decades of experience dealing with toxic exposures like these, and can speak to the process of the human body and how this results in immediate impacts, long-term impacts, the kinds of levels that are likely to be out in the community to be causing short-term impacts, which, spoiler alert, it's got to be pretty high. And then my colleague Tim Fox, who is the former Attorney General of Montana. And I would encourage anybody with questions about how can they get their elected officials and representatives to do more, to talk to Tim about that, because he used to be in that chair receiving those phone calls from his constituents, and he knows what it's like to be on the receiving end, and can help give you guidance on how to make your voice heard. And then I think at the end, Bobby Kennedy Jr. Can really just bring it all together and provide us some perspective on what we're dealing with and what to do more. And I see a question. Yeah, I'll answer that, and then I'll bring on Dr. Carpenter.
Yeah, it's a question I think some other folks have asked. Do you want us to hold our questions to the end, or do you want?
Well, that was my plan, but I've been hearing from folks, so if you got one.
Okay, I've got numerous ones, and it may be better to have one of the other speakers address it.
What, yeah, why don't we hold that for the end then, and then we'll
Okay,
take
we're
those
gonna hold
questions.
all the questions for the end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dr. Carpenter, would you like to come speak?
I'm going to talk right from here, I think. Let me sort of introduce myself. I'm a public health physician. That means I have an MD degree, but I don't practice medicine, I don't see patients. I'm a very active researcher. I teach at the University at Albany, part of the SUNY system, where I was the former dean of the School of Public Health. So what is a public health physician? I don't see patients. I'm not licensed to practice medicine, but I study the environmental causes of human disease. And I've been very involved in that for 40 years. I worked with Bobby for about that period of time.
Let me just interrupt for a second. I asked David to be here this morning. David Carpenter I've used him on many cases. He's probably testified in more cases than, particularly in the area of toxicity and PCBs and other things. Organic chemicals. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me now? So I'm Robert Kennedy, and I want to thank you all for coming. I just want to introduce David because he speaks with a voice that is really authoritative. If we go to trial on this, we almost certainly will use him as an expert witness. He is respected throughout the field. He has published, he is one of the key publishers on toxicity and human exposure, the impacts, the illnesses that result from human exposure to toxic chemicals. I first started working with him 40 years ago on the Hudson. He played a key role in getting General Electric to remove its PCBs from the Hudson. Monsanto has made a war on him. He's worked on the Monsanto cases. We won a record settlement against Monsanto. In the end, settling for about $13 billion. He played a key role in many of those cases. And Monsanto has declared war on Dr. Carpenter as public enemy #1. For the past year, they've been so successful at pressuring his college, SUNY Albany, that he's one of the most popular professors at that college. And they, including with PhD students who need to consult with him practically daily. The college, under pressure from Monsanto, suspended all of his teaching activities for the last year. There was a public outcry from the entire environmental community, which forced the college recently to restore him as a professor. He has total integrity. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of all of these toxic organic chemicals. And I'm very grateful to you for coming here today, David. And I wanted him to come down because there's no expert that is going to be able to give you a straighter story on how to protect yourself from exposures, what you should do in your home, what you should do with your lives, which to me is the most important thing. It's more important than recovering money. It's more important than beating or punishing this company. The most important thing that I hope we leave here today is with some strategies for you protecting yourself, your children, your pets, your farm animals, your livelihood, and all of those, and we can help you with that. My other wish is that throughout this process, as you have questions that arise, that we will be here to answer those questions and to, if we don't know the answers, to connect you with experts like David Carpenter so that you will be able to make good strategic decisions about how to protect your health and how to safeguard your families.
Thank you, Bobby, you embarrass me. Let me say that I have been involved in one critical issue that's relevant to this area. That is health effects in people that live near fracking sites and compressor stations. When the governor of New York banned fracking in New York State, he waived a manuscript of mine which looks at the releases of volatile organic chemicals around fracking sites and compressor stations in 5 states, including Pennsylvania and Ohio. And you know, what I've been involved in there, again, is looking at these health effects and complaints of people that live near those fracking sites. Now you have a somewhat similar but a different situation. You've got a one-time event with incredibly high intensity releases. In the fracking situation, poor people that don't own the land and can't afford to move somewhere else are exposed day in and day out for years. So it's not exactly the same, but some of the chemicals are the same, some of them are different. Now, I've also been very involved in looking at long-term effects of exposure, including assisting attorneys in developing medical monitoring programs. Now, medical monitoring programs are good in the sense that if you're going to be at increased risk of some disease, it's very nice to know what those diseases are so you can work with your physicians to find them early. If something causes cancer, you want to find it early so it can be treated. If something causes diabetes, you want to find early when there's symptoms of developing diabetes so you can treat, change your lifestyle, that sort of thing. So that really is important. Now, clearly, I can't answer all the questions that I think everybody has about what the health effects are. I can say that the effects of acute exposure to volatile organic chemicals, rashes, headaches, feeling like your brain doesn't work quite right, respiratory effects, these are well documented. And in a case like this, where there's a sudden event, the contaminants in the air should go away relatively quickly. These are chemicals that are used in plastics manufacture, but they are volatile, especially when they're heated. And so that event should relatively quickly pass. If you can smell it, there's still some in the air. I totally agree with the evacuation orders that occurred for people that were close, because what's critical is preventing exposure, and getting away until the chemicals go into the air is a good thing. Now, one of the questions, though, is are there long-term health effects of even a short exposure? In general, there aren't. But, you know, some of those things that went in the air, vinyl chloride is a carcinogen, benzene is a carcinogen. And even an acute exposure may have long-term effects, although probably not very significant ones. But we're beginning to find in a number of situations of acute exposure, 9/11, the Gulf oil spill, emergency responders and cleanup people, even though these events happened 10, 20 years ago, some of those people are now showing symptoms that people that weren't involved in those cleanups and remediations do not. So that needs to be addressed. And unfortunately, well, fortunately, it's very difficult in retrospect to actually determine how much one was exposed to. Now, the thing I'm most concerned about, and I think probably most people here are, is dioxin. When you burn a chlorinated compound like vinyl chloride at a relatively low temperature, it forms dibenzofurands and dioxins. These are often referred to as some of the most dangerous compounds ever made. They were never intentionally made, but they're products of fires of anything that contains chlorine. Vinyl chloride is only carbon and chlorine. Now, there have been other studies that I've been involved in which look at the health effects of dioxin. There are probably a number of Vietnam vets here. The US government sprayed Vietnam with Agent Orange. Dioxin was a minor byproduct of Agent Orange manufacture. And I got the first grant that the US federal government ever awarded to study the effects of Vietnamese women who gave birth to a child with birth defects. Because we know that dioxin at high exposure causes birth defects, primarily birth defects of the central nervous system. Anencephaly, no brain. Spina bifida, where your spine doesn't fuse. Cleft lip, cleft palate. In the end run, the US government canceled my grant because they were afraid if we showed what I feared we would show, that the US government would have to pay reparations to all of the women and men in Vietnam who gave birth to a child that had these central nervous system effects. So these are potentially serious things. Now the difference here is you had a one event exposure where Vietnam, the US government sprayed Agent Orange for years. We have another situation in Cerveto, Italy, where a chemical plant had an explosion. And this chemical plant was making things like Agent Orange, where dioxin was a minor contaminant. Investigators have studied the people that live in that region for 20 years. And there were long-term health effects related to individuals that had high levels of exposure. Now, it's very important that we get measurements of dioxin in this community. Dioxin affects human health, it can contaminate the soil, it can contaminate and alter animal health, farm animals, pet animals. It can get in the food supply and spread beyond just the local area. The US National Academy of Sciences a few years ago had a committee of which I was a member on dioxin-like chemicals in the US food supply. And we need to address that issue urgently. To my knowledge, nobody has reported on dioxin levels. Measuring dioxin is complicated, it's very expensive, but it needs to be done. Once it gets in the soil, it's very difficult to prevent additional exposure. So again, long-term health effects, long-term issues about cleanup and getting rid of the contamination. So I'm here to try to help answer some of these questions, to be a resource to Morgan & Morgan and any other firm that has issues like this. And I will pass the talk to.
Thanks, Doctor. Again, my name is Tim Fox. As was mentioned, I'm the former Attorney General of Montana, but ultimately I've been practicing law now for 35 years, and a good portion of my time practicing law has been in the environmental arena, toxic torts, those kinds of things. And so I'm very familiar with the procedures that one has to take in a situation like this to fully understand from a scientific basis what the impacts are. Also economic basis. We probably have a number of business owners here who are concerned about the future of their business. Will people come to eat at their restaurants or whatever the case may be? These are all issues that this community obviously is very concerned, and for a very large radius around East Palestine, there are people who are asking these questions, and how do we deal with that? We met a woman earlier today who is in the agricultural business, and there are questions about once these airborne contaminants or waterborne contaminants get into the soils, what is their half-life, so to speak? Where do they go? Do we need to be concerned about food that's grown or animals that are exposed to these things? These are all questions that we're all grappling with. I should add that, Morgan & Morgan is particularly well suited to address these issues, and while it may seem cumbersome and perhaps too lengthy sometimes to try to address these kinds of claims in the court of law, this is the American jurisprudence system, and this is the best that we have. And Morgan & Morgan is particularly well suited because they are the largest plaintiff and injury law firm in the country. We do these things day in and day out on individual basis, and things like personal injury lawsuits, car wrecks, you name it, slip and fall, but on a large basis as well, where we take on some of the largest corporations in the world. And it's important to have an advocate that can go toe-to-toe and not be intimidated by a company who's got more money than God, sometimes it seems like, and oftentimes is only protecting the bottom line and trying to fight every step of the way rather than to admitting the mistakes that they've made and trying to redress the issues that you all and many others have. As former Attorney General, I had, of course, a lot of contacts. Governor DeWine was an Attorney General. We served together. David Yost, your current Attorney General here in Ohio, and I are friends and acquaintances. And so I've had contact with both of their offices because it'll be very important for claimants like yourself, many of which will be represented by lawyers and law firms, to have that kind of communication with the leaders, those folks who are in office, to make sure that we're communicating and coordinating. Because ultimately, our goal is to make sure that we get the very best outcomes for our clients. But there's a longer term question here in terms of what do we do differently? What does this company do differently? What does the railroad companies in general, the industry, do differently so that others don't have to go through the things that you're going through now? Those will all be important aspects of the broader sense of why we're here as a law firm, why Mr. Kennedy's here, because he's been advocating for changes to make sure that people like you don't have to go through these things time and time and again. And frankly, you have to ring the bell when things are hot, right? Now we have an opportunity to create change from a policy standpoint, as well as addressing your concerns and your claims and the impact that this has had on you. I think it's important in the limited time that we have left that we probably go to a little more Q&A from here, unless, Bobby, if you had any more comments you wanted to make before we do that, but we're going to be a little pressed for time here, and we want to make sure we take as many questions as we can.
Let me just say a couple of things. First of all, thank you all for coming. You don't want to hear a lot about what I do, but I'm just going to explain kind of how I ended up with Morgan & Morgan. I spent 40 years of my career, or 30 years of my career, suing big polluters, the biggest polluters in the country on the Hudson River, working for commercial fishermen on the Hudson and recreational fishermen. I bought over 300 lawsuits. We forced polluters to spend about $3.5 billion cleaning up the Hudson. Today, largely as a result of our work, Hudson is an international model for ecosystem protection. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left on the east coast of North America. It still has strong spawning stocks of all its historical species of migratory fish. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired the creation of riverkeeper groups now on 350 rivers. We're the largest water protection group in the world. I started doing some of these class action, multi-district litigation, individual tort cases in about 2014. Originally suing Conoco down in Florida for a contamination incident, and then working on the Gulf cases with Morgan & Morgan and a number of other cases. And what I found in 2015, I did the closing arguments and was on lead counsel, or one of the lead counsels on a case in West Virginia where we won the biggest jury trial judgment in the history of the state against a company called Spelter. And I recognized then that in many, I've been bringing statutory cases my whole life under the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and it wasn't really changing corporate behavior. It wasn't having an impact on making these companies more responsible. It was really just the cost of doing business for these companies. And then I started winning these big judgments. I recognized that this was getting up to the boardroom, and people in those boardrooms, when you win $1 billion judgment, that people in that boardroom are saying, we gotta change our behavior. We may have to fire some people, et cetera. And that became, for me, a better way of changing corporate behavior, but also a way of actually affecting individual lives of the people who are injured. And the reason I work with Morgan & Morgan is not only because their size allows them to go toe-to-toe with the biggest companies in the world, but they were, to me, very, very impressive about their attention to client relations. And if there's clients who are unhappy with the law firm, I was associated with the law firm, I was getting calls and emails. And I didn't want to get those kind. And what I found in this case, in the Porter Ranch case, when I was the lead counsel, and it's about, we're now settling that case for $1.8 billion. This was the gas leak, and it was a one-time gas leak that affected about 10,000 people. And there are still clients from that case who are calling me, and the attention that Morgan & Morgan has paid to them, not only in terms of kind of the settlement that they're getting, but also helping them protect themselves, helping them get medical help for their family and direct them to the right solutions. And for me, that's more important than any settlement. Is my reputation and my feeling that I'm doing something to help people on the ground. Dr. Carpenter was talking about the Agent Orange cases. In the Agent Orange case, my uncle, Ted Kennedy, was chairman of the Health Committee in 1975 when the Agent Orange scandal broke. Because the Army had been denying, the Veterans Administration had been denying the impact of of Agent Orange causing Gulf War syndrome and the deaths of tens of thousands of American service people and the illnesses among hundreds of thousands and who had been exposed to Agent Orange. And they had the CDC, a woman named Colleen Boyle, who was writing these phony scientific reports to justify not paying the veterans what the government had owed them from injuring them. So CDC was collaborating with the Pentagon and the health officials to cover up these injuries. And that is the problem that we have. The government agencies have been captured by these industries. DOT is a sock puppet for Norfolk Southern. It is a subsidiary of Norfolk Southern. It is not representing the American people. And unfortunately, I found from probably 20% of the lawsuits I've brought over the past 40 years have been up against EPA for collaborating with the industry to hide the impacts of pollution, or to allow them to pollute, to make sweetheart deals that allow them to pollute. And it's part of the business plan of these industries to compromise the public health agencies and to capture them. And they've successfully done it The pharmaceutical industry owns FDA, NIH, CDC. The oil and chemical industries own EPA. The big, industrial farms like Smithfield, Cargill, and Monsanto, and Tyson's own USDA. These companies, these agencies are not working for the American people. And that's why you need independent sources of information who are interested in your welfare, and you need vigilance. Now, we don't know what happened with this case. We know one thing. Negligence occurred. We don't know what level. I don't think, after having talked extensively with Mayor Conway and understanding his explanation of why they blew those train cars, I have doubts about whether negligence occurred in that particular decision. According to what he told me, the rail car was heating up because there was fires in the area, and it had melted liquefied the binding agent that was holding together the vinyl chloride. And there is a self-sustaining process that then occurs where the vinyl chloride was on its own through a chemical process heating up. It was heating up, according to the mayor, at 3 degrees per hour. And it was at 155 degrees, at 185 degrees, it explodes. And it would have flattened a large part of the town, according to what he told me, and covered almost all the town with deadly shrapnel. And that's why both governors of 2 states and the public health officials were all in on the decision. It was made in the open with all these officials. So I do not necessarily believe that that particular decision was negligence. The negligence occurred at some point. We don't know why. We don't know if it was because there weren't enough personnel on the train, or whether they were too tired because they weren't given work breaks. We don't know whether it's because they didn't have ECT brakes and they were using brakes that they've been using since the Civil War. We don't know whether it's because they didn't have DOT 117 tank cars that are much safer, and where these kind of accidents should never happen. We don't know whether they didn't have proper protocols, whether they didn't have what they knew for 20 miles, that the wheels were on fire. You can see it on people's doorbell ringers. You can go on the internet and see this. So there's supposed to be sensors on those wheels that notify the locomotive if there's a wheel that's overheating. So what happened? Were the engineers not paying attention? And if not, why not? Or did the sensors not work? We don't know. We will have a discovery process where we're able to make that determination. And that is what we need to do. We know that negligence occurred. We know that because this is not supposed to happen. And not only that, but with this railroad, it seems to happen again and again and again. So there is some systemic negligence in the process that we need to uncover and confront them with. And, the people who own this railroad, they do not care about the people of Eastern Ohio or East Palestine. They don't care. Who is it who owns it? It's Vanguard, owns 8% of this railroad. The biggest, financial house in the world. 5% owned by BlackRock. And guess what? BlackRock and Vanguard own each other. So these companies, they do not care what is happening to the people or the cargo. The only thing they care about is the bottom line. And that pressure from Wall Street completely divorces this company from these communities or from any care about what happens in these communities. And they externalize their costs. So if you talk to these big shots, the fat cat from BlackRock and Vanguard and Norfolk Southern, they'll tell you, oh, it's just free market capitalism. But it's not free market capitalism. It's corporate crony capitalism. It is corporate kleptocracy. It is these companies using political clout to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay their production costs. In a true free market system would promote efficiency. And efficiency means the elimination of waste, the elimination of pollution. Pollution is waste. And the elimination of accidents. In a true free market would require that company to properly value the natural resources and the communities and the quality of life of the communities through which it runs. In a true free market, you can't make yourself rich without making your neighbors rich, without enriching your community. But what Norfolk Southern does is it makes itself rich by making everybody else poor. It raises standards of living for itself by lowering quality of life for the rest of us. And it does that by escaping the discipline of the free market, by capturing the agencies and disarming them so it can do anything it wants. And what we do as a law firm, and what I do as an individual, is I go out into the marketplace where these entities are cheating us, are stealing from us. This is an act of theft. They have stolen the peace of mind of this community. They've stolen the property values. They've stolen the livelihoods. They've stolen the salaries. They've stolen the health of these communities. It is a theft. They are looking at the landscapes in East Palestine and around, and they are commoditizing them. And then they're liquidating them for cash. They're treating this part of the country as if it were a business in liquidation, converting it to cash as fast as they can, and filling their pockets. And what we do is we go out into the marketplace and we find these cheaters, and we say to them, we're going to force you to internalize your costs the same way that you've been internalizing your profit. You're not sharing your profits with us. You're only sharing the cost. In a true free market, the actor in the market has to pay all the costs of bringing his product to market, including the cost of keeping the community safe, including the cost of cleaning up after themselves, which was a lesson we were all supposed to have learned in kindergarten. So we're going to reteach them that lesson. And I don't know whether we're going to use class action. I don't know whether we use multi-district litigation. We're going to do what's best for you. We got to make that determination. But we're going to teach them a lesson. So thank you very much, and we want to answer your questions.
Robert Kennedy Jr. here, and he's had so much experience, not just with litigation in these arenas, but obviously he's an advocate for the little guy, which is what Morgan & Morgan is all about too. So what we'd like to do, if you have a question, we'll have a couple of microphones to float around. I'll just leave it up to our help here to hand you one and ask your question. We don't have a lot of time, folks, and so if you can make your question as succinct as possible, ask one question so someone else can ask a question, and we'll try to answer it. Sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, sir.
I just want to make the comment toward Mr. Kennedy. Thank you for all of us for being straight with us.
Yeah.
Because I mentioned, if you're not getting death threats, I guarantee a lot of people probably don't want you saying what you just said. And I hope I speak for all of us. You just gave us some real good information, and I hope we can appreciate what he just mentioned to us, because he's telling us the truth. Because if one of us had said something as he just said to us, we would be construed as crazy nuts, and they blow us off. Fortunately for him, he's in a much higher position than us, so I applaud you and I thank you.
Thank you. Do we have a question? Anyone out there have a question? We'll get the microphone to you. Raise your hand, please. There's a young lady here. And if you have to go, again, thank you for being here, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Barbara Levy, and I lived in New York for close to 40 years, and on the Hudson River also. So I just want to applaud you for the Riverkeeper system. It's remarkable, healing, and it works.
Great.
In addition, I do have a question. In recent years, waste has become a commodity to be sold. And my fear is, well, if this is a commodity, these companies absolutely don't want any of this to happen. They don't want the lawsuits because they're making money off of the waste. How do you handle that?
Well, let me try to tackle that first and foremost. I think more needs to be done in terms of making sure that our industrialized companies in this country produce less waste. And obviously we have systems for treating that waste. We saw that here on East Palestine recently when we learned that a lot of the waste was being trucked out of state to places unknown. It is a highly regulated industry, and I think we need to incentivize companies to produce less waste and to treat it right. And as Mr. Kennedy mentioned, there's a lot of shenanigans that go on in our governmental system that allow things that just shouldn't happen. Those are issues that are beyond our immediate issues, obviously, here in East Palestine, but are interconnected. And you can be assured that our firm deals with that in the long-term reclamation remediation side of this tragedy, because that area has to be cleaned up to the condition it was, if not better, than before this happened. And that is one of the things that we will hold this company accountable for. Sir?
I think your question is a good one, and I want to turn this over because I don't know about those injection wells, where they're getting rid of the liquid waste. I have not looked into them. I've found throughout my career big problems with injection wells. Then the solid waste, they're incinerating it 20 miles from here. Oh, and the incinerators, there are different kinds of incinerators, but incinerators are just taking it and transferring it into another form. Now, I don't know what happens to dioxin in an incinerator. Dioxin is created from burning. It's the only way you make it. You burn chlorine with hydrocarbons. And that's how you make it. Dioxin is, some people argue that it is the most toxic molecule in the universe that we know about that is not radioactive. There is no safe level of dioxin exposure. A single molecule of dioxin can cause the kind of horrendous, this grim inventory of catastrophic illnesses and birth defects and cancers that Dr. Carpenter was referring to, was listing before. So I'd like to ask Dr. Carpenter what he says about the capacity for incinerators to eliminate dioxin.
Well, incinerators that operate at very high temperatures will destroy dioxin. The biggest source of dioxin exposure in the US today is backyard burner barrels that are burning plastic, because that's at a low temperature. Most incinerators, the reason that we have such stringent requirements for emissions from incinerators is because of the concern of dioxin. So a proper incinerator will not release very much dioxin. It still releases a little bit. But because of the Clean Air Act, we have dramatically reduced dioxin exposure from incinerators. But I know in rural areas, I used to do it myself. You burn your trash in the backyard unless you have a trash collection system. And backyard burn barrels are very, very dangerous to human health and to the environment. Incinerators that don't act properly are extremely dangerous. And a fire that's not controlled, that's not going to be operating at more than 2,000 degrees centigrade, is going to form dioxin.
Thank you, Doctor. Do we have any other questions about the East Palestine situation? Do you want to? Oh, okay, here we go.
We've touched on a little bit with the soil and the animals, but what do we do right now with our cattle, our crops, our gardens? What are we doing with all of that now?
Right. Well, a couple of things I want to mention. Today, apparently, there was a town hall elsewhere in Ohio where the State Department of Agriculture was trying to address some of those concerns with the agricultural industry. And so I think, you'd want to talk with your local soil and conservation district and also with your Department of Agriculture for sure. In the meantime, we don't, as Mr. Kennedy has mentioned, there are a lot of questions that have yet to be answered, which are some of the things that we will try to get down to in order to inform not only our clients, but you all, so that you know where you stand on those issues. Frankly, personally, I would refrain from eating anything within a 30-mile radius that's been grown or raised until we know a little bit more about where these plumes have migrated, both the air and the water plumes, what the longer term situation is. And the doctor might have something to say too. For instance, the vinyl chloride, that's a DNA mutating chemical. Which essentially causes diseases by mutating not just human organisms' DNA, but also the DNA of animals.
That's absolutely correct.
So we need to be very, very careful too. We're not trying to instill panic or create concerns where there shouldn't be any. It's just that there's too much unknown here. We're real concerned about the agricultural community and our food chain in this area. Sir, let's get to someone else that hasn't had a chance to ask a question. Sir?
Hi. There's been a lot of discussion about analytes being tested and ultimately their health effects. But one of my concerns is that in incomplete combustion, especially of organics, you can generate a whole host of other chemicals. For instance, creosote-treated railroad ties have about 300 chemicals that have been identified in them, and they believe that there may be up to 10,000 more chemicals. Think about when you burn that and all the other chemicals being created, dioxins and furans. One of the big concerns I've got is this has not followed the typical circular recruit process in that where are all the corporate-wide plans that should have been in effect for a contingency like this, that then those plans could have been quickly revised to deal with the site-specific conditions. I've seen none of that. And the other thing is, where's the analyte list? We're not just testing for, vinyl chloride. Based on what I just said, there should be a host of tests being run, literally for hundreds and hundreds of chemicals under SW 846 with the USPA. And I have not seen that, and your cases, your lawsuits are only as good as the data that you get from the work they're doing now.
So I should add that Morgan & Morgan filed a suit on behalf of some individuals and asked for class status about 2 weeks ago, and Renee is the lead on that lawsuit. And we are doing testing, and we're doing more than the EPA or the state is doing, if you want to mention.
Yeah, and I can speak to your question because I testified at the Pennsylvania Senate hearing about this very issue. In all of these cases that we talked about before, and in any industry where you're handling toxic, combustible chemicals, you have emergency response plans, emergency response manuals ahead of time to enact in the case that something does go wrong. I've not seen it either. They've never released one to the public, so it's not clear whether they even had one. But if they did, and most companies do, even though they're often deficient, like they were when these prior disasters occurred. When they're deficient, they compound the disaster, and that's what we have here. But regardless of whether it was the best response plan in the world or completely deficient, which is much more likely, I can guarantee you that there's not a single page in there that says, empty it all into a ditch and light it on fire. Because that's not the plan for anybody. So with regards to the analyte list, I've seen some of what EPA's testing is, and it's extraordinarily limited. There are very few things that they actually tested for. They tested for total VOCs, which doesn't really tell you much. Particulate matter, which again doesn't really tell you much. And there is some limited further speciation of what they tested. But not only is it limited in the amount of things they're looking for, it's also limited by the detection limits, which were set extraordinarily high. So, you know, these tests that they are representing say everything is safe, I don't think they can tell you much, and I certainly don't think they tell you that things are safe. So we're doing our own
That's
tests.
a really good point, and I won't take too much time here, Fairfield. About quantitation and detection limits, the doctor can maybe speak to that, maybe you can, but just because they don't detect this whole host of chemicals in, for instance, the tap water,
I saw DeWine drinking it with the residents. Just because the test results show non-detect doesn't mean the chemical isn't there.
Right.
Tests are only good to a certain level, to a detection limit, and you could still have bad health effects when there is no detection. So these are the kinds of things I don't see in the media, and I just don't understand why they're not covering it.
I can't speak for the media. We have some media here, and I do want to say I appreciate the media being here, getting the word out, helping us to tell the truth, get the facts out, identify the issues that need to be addressed. So next question. Thank you for that question and that point. I appreciate it.
Just so everybody knows, I'm gonna do this side and then that side, just so it makes it easier, because we've got one mic.
We can take the second mic here that Mr. Kennedy was. So do we have someone with a mic back there now? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Just to continue along the point the young woman raised about food. There's been a lot of emphasis about air and water and food. We can't overemphasize it enough, because you hear about Ukraine being the breadbasket of the world. People around this country and everyone looking at this has to recognize that this area is the breadbasket for the tri-state area. We have the best corn, peaches, apples, and I eat a lot of it, and I'm sure a lot of people do here too. I grow my own garden. A lot of friends grow their own garden. The cost, there has to be some way, and maybe when you guys get involved in this, to have the railroad pay for the farmers to test definitely where the smoke plume has been verified to go over their farms. Test the soil before they grow it, and when the corn gets harvested, the railroad has to pay for it. And if that food is not edible for 5 years, then the railroad needs to compensate those farmers. And then how much does each individual resident get allocated because they can't eat their own garden?
Sure. So I think illustrative of the point that you make and others make is that everyone who's impacted by this train derailment and the ensuing conflagration and contamination is differently situated from the person next door or sitting next to you or what have you. Morgan & Morgan prides itself on making sure that the clients that we represent are interviewed, that we have a full understanding of the impact of these types of things on them. And we're looking at categories here. I mean, we have municipalities that have issues who sent first responders to the site. They have issues with exposure for their personnel and equipment that they've been told that they can no longer use. That's just one example. We have businesses who are seeing a downtick in their clientele coming in. We have agricultural farmers and ranchers who have all these questions. So it's going to take a little time, but that's why we're on this right away, because as Mr. Kennedy pointed out, our biggest concern, and I believe yours, individually and collectively, is that we need to address the needs and the claims of the individuals and communities who've been impacted by this. And that's the bottom line for us, and I think for you as well. Next question over here.
I'll take one here until Mr. Kennedy is back.
Yeah, I come down here to get some information, and I live 1.2 miles from where the train derailed. And if I come down here and sign up with your firm, what do I have to show as far as what happened to me? I mean,
Well, let me just speak generally to that. Again, because everyone's different, and we have some tips. If you didn't pick up one of these when you came in, please do so before you leave. There's a portion on the back that says about understanding your rights. There's tips and reminders on the front. And so you need to chronicle things: onset of irritation, health issues, seeing the doctor, whatever the impact is to you and your family, your business, what have you. That's highly personal, and you need to chronicle those things. Keep a diary, if you will, right? And then, whether it's Morgan & Morgan or some other firm who may ultimately represent one or more of you, their task will be to make sure that you, again, understand your rights and responsibilities, that you chronicle the issues that you're experiencing, whether it be economic, health, or otherwise, and that we help quantify that and determine whether or not there is a valid claim. Beyond that, I mean, we could talk for days on what a lawsuit looks like. I can tell you as an attorney for 35 years, I don't relish the fact that anyone has to go to court to address their claims or the problems that they're having. But in a situation like this, where the company is not coming to the table and trying to rectify the issues on its own, there has to be a legal system to hold them accountable.
Yeah, I understand. First 3 days for the fire, from Friday and all day Saturday, and the next 3 days, we did have headaches, we did have sinuses, but it's cleared up. I mean, it's definitely gone. But for them 3 days, it was caused by the fire, and watching the video from, everybody had their drones up there, I can see the smoke was coming right over our house.
Sure.
You couldn't see the street lights on our street.
Yeah.
But them 3 days after the fire, we were sick. But now, my sinuses cleared up. But so how do I go about proving to you that we got sick because of the smoke?
I'm sorry, the question again?
How do we prove to you that we got sick because of the smoke?
Oh, sure. Well, we incorporate all manner of experts, including medical experts, when we take on a client. And so those are all assessed. As the good doctor mentioned, a lot of these problems, health problems, don't manifest themselves for some time. And what we've seen is a transition of this tragedy from the original fire and overheating of the bearings, and then the derailment itself, and then how that was handled. And we've gone through a whole cycle, if you will, of environmental contamination, whether it be airborne, waterborne, now in the soil. And there, of course, are issues with these chemicals. Whether you ingest a little or a lot, there may always be consequences. But we come alongside our clients to help assess those issues and try to get them redressed, not just in the short term, but in the long term.
The answer to your question is keep a diary. That's what you need. If you haven't been keeping a journal, write down right now, as quickly as you can, what happened to you. Yeah, and that's good. You want to keep all your records If you went to the drugstore to buy aspirin, keep that record, because that's not only an expense that you should be reimbursed for, but it's evidence of your contemporaneous evidence that what you're saying about your health at that time is true. And what we know, again,
Right.
you have to show both the exposure and the effect.
Right.
And the effect,
There's-
if you were sick at home and you didn't tell anybody about it, you can still prove that by keeping a diary.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been able to do is we can actually model the air quality, the changes in the wind direction. We actually know where these contaminants went and when in a general sense. And so that layered with the individual experience of claimants, we can tie them together. There's a cause and an effect. And so that's what we're good at doing. Another question over here. And that is great advice. Keep a diary, write things down, time, date, who experienced it, who you met with, who you talked to, what was said, those kinds of things. Sir?
My name's Bob Moore. I'm a local landowner, about 9 miles from the site. And I want to call a little bullshit, okay, on some things. I've got the way you prove your property, your damages. All this collection, all this record, you're already damaged. You're not investigators, you're not attorneys, and they're putting the burden on you. I've got a better way. Demand, and I don't see any of them here, demand that your county officials come in and immediately reappraise your property value and declare your property worthless and eliminate your property tax, bankrupt the city, bankrupt the school, bankrupt everybody that gets money from your property taxes. Demand that, because once they come in and do that, your damages are done. You've proven your damage. Your property, your life savings is gone. I heard recently that your banks are not taking any loan applications. Every one of you should go to the bank tomorrow, today. Go to the bank and apply for a loan. When the bank rejects your loan, you have damages. Okay? The way to get your damages is demand a moratorium on sales tax in your community. What does that do? It either brings your customers and clients back, or it shows further damages. The evidence will be clear. The way you save yourself is demand, and I see none of them here, demand your elected officials come to the community and to be the guy that has your back. Because they're not there, they don't have your back. They're handing you a line of bullshit. You don't need to do any more work. Make them do the work. Declare your property worthless, destroy their tax base, and something then will happen. Here.
Thank you, sir. Another question? Any other questions? We've got two over here behind you.
Yes,
Oh,
hi.
here, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
This is for Dr. Carpenter. David, there have been a number of community members, especially people that evacuated and were in the line of the aerial plume, that are still complaining about residual odors in their homes, rashes. Could you comment a little bit about how these chemicals can sorbed to materials like carpeting or bedding and things like that, clothing, and how long those folks could expect that in their homes before it clears, or will it ever clear?
Well, it's a good question. I think the answer is, as long as you can smell something, it's there. Now, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily very dangerous as the concentration goes down. I think we all need to realize that we're all exposed to some of these chemicals every day. If you fill your gas tank with gasoline, you're going to be inhaling some of these same chemicals, benzene and the other volatile organics. So none of us can totally avoid exposure, but excessive exposure is really very dangerous. And in this case, we know who's responsible.
Yeah, in the Smelter case in West Virginia, and David can verify this, what we found is we actually went to everybody's attic and we tested the dust, and we found huge levels of their organic chemicals in that dust. And those chemicals were volatilizing during hot days, et cetera, and re-poisoning, recontaminating, re-exposing people in the house. One of the things, and again, I'd ask David to comment on it, because my major concern, again, is that you protect yourself. One of the things that I would advise people to do to reduce their exposures is to get your house thoroughly cleaned professionally and keep cleaning it until there's no dust left. That dust will become a source for contamination. And I want to thank, I love what this gentleman back here said about property taxes. I have to look into what?
Everybody with a child in East Palestine School District needs to pull their child tomorrow, Monday, from the school and apply for open enrollment at Columbiana, at Crestview, at Latonia, at some other school. Pull your children from the schools. This will prove your damages. When the community has no school, it has no value. Your damages are done.
So we only have time.
Let me ask David just to comment on people's attics.
Well, one of the, as Bobby said, one of the real problems is that these organic chemicals get absorbed, they get in the house dust, they get in the carpets, and as long as it's there, that's going to continue to volatilize. So as Bobby said, cleaning is absolutely essential. In fact, the way you measure these chemicals is to collect house dust. So get rid of the house dust. Either vacuum or excessively clean your carpets, the draperies, all of those things, because they become reservoirs that will continue to contaminate the home.
Well, I tell you what, I'm a parent and a grandparent, and I live thousands of miles from here. But I can only imagine, that a lot of folks have lost a lot of sleep over this. There's a lot of stress, and so ultimately, our goal is to try to alleviate some of that with information, representation, et cetera. We have another question here, okay? Ma'am?
You basically answered all of my questions about, how you clean and stuff. And I have been detoxing my body every day and doing air purifiers and stuff like that. But my question is my son is still constantly having effects, and he's approximately 2.5 miles from, the actual derailment. And when they went to the local doctor for their symptoms, their response from the doctor was basically, we're seeing a lot of people with these symptoms, but they're not really doing anything about it. So, should he then just bypass local doctors and go directly to like a toxicologist? Like, what should he do in that aspect? Because
Sure.
there's really nothing that they're doing for him.
Yeah, so, and I'm gonna let the good doctor answer this better probably than I can, but it still is worthwhile to chronicle the symptoms that folks are experiencing either in a diary, as Mr. Kennedy mentioned, or to go see a physician who would then, of course, have notes and document the visit, the symptoms that the patient was experiencing, and any prescription or directions on how they should handle it. I'm sure it's not uncommon that we're seeing temporary symptoms that alleviate themselves over time, and so physicians are not prescribing anything in general other than not being exposed anymore and detoxing, as you say. What would you like to add to that, doctor?
I think that's absolutely right. You go in with a sore throat, your doctor's not going to do very much about it. You can document in your diary, and that would be as effective as having to go to the doctor and have to pay a copay. Just that diary is so important. On this day, I had a headache. My throat was sore. I felt dizzy. That kind of thing in a diary is the evidence that is going to be needed if you end up with any legal action.
And again, what we do is we match the individual's symptoms and what they're experiencing with what we're seeing in the environment, which can be quantified through data. And that again is one of the reasons we've hired so many experts already who have been in the field and started doing this work even weeks ago. We have another question back there, sir.
Thank you for allowing me to ask a question. My question is about some of what can we do about, I really feel this could have been prevented. What can we do in a political sense where the brake system in some of these trains dates back to the Civil War era? To my understanding, some of these huge trains only need one locomotive engineer to operate these ungodly number of length trains, and it's mortifying that I have a grandson and a son who live 12 miles from here, from the site. But I mean, this could happen tomorrow, and what can we do to get the reforms passed that are necessary to make this less likely to ever happen again?
Sure. Let me give you an example, and I think Mr. Kennedy mentioned this. There were sensors along the rail that detected that there was an overheating going on a particular bearing. I think the first was 38 degrees over what they call ambient temperature, then it was 150 degrees over ambient, and by the time it was 250 degrees over ambient, it was too late because there was already a fire. There were no regulations that set, as I understand it, when the railroad company had to act with the information they had, because they knew from these detectors that there was an issue, but their internal policies didn't have a plan of action until essentially it was too late. It was over 200 degrees. By then, that particular car, which as I understand it had PVC pipe or polyvinyl chloride components in it, was already on fire. Then, as you mentioned, by the time they applied the brakes, it was too late, and the brakes, of course, overreacted in the sense that things stopped too abruptly. It caused the derailment. Now, the NTSB has already issued an advisory concerning when a railroad company should take action when they detect an overheating bearing. Too late, too little for our experience here, right? There will be those kinds of discussions down the road, and Mr. Kennedy is particularly well suited because of his connections and his bully pulpit, if you will, but there will be plenty of others. We can also try to address some of those issues through lawsuits. We have a little problem in what they call preemption, because most of interstate transportation, particularly as it deals with railroads, is regulated by the federal government. And so there's always this tug and pull as to whether a state, for instance, or even a local community might require something different or more stringent in terms of safety requirements than the federal government does. However, we can, in a prospective way, seek relief to change the way that these companies do business. We know that Norfolk Southern, for instance, disincentivized things like maintenance and safety for creating more revenues. They had longer trains. And so they were telling their executives, do things to cut corners, essentially, and make more money. But ultimately, this is what happens, is a disaster when you do that. And Mr. Kennedy made that point real well, that the almighty dollar is dictating what folks are doing. I would encourage you to call your elected officials at every level. Certainly your United States senators and your congressmen and women. You need to make sure that they understand that you personally and your family were impacted, your business was impacted by the lack of regulation, the lack of policies that caused ultimately some of this to happen. we will do the same thing. We will use our bully pulpit to ask and demand change down the road as well. And to the extent that we can get prospective relief to change Norfolk Southern's way of operating in a lawsuit, we will attempt to do that as well. And again, the issue there is whether we're preempted by federal law from requiring those things. They can agree to a safety standard that's more stringent than the federal government holds them to and be bound by that. And so we would look into that and in terms of the longer term situation on what we want to happen so that no one else has to experience what you've experienced here. Does that make sense? We'll get back to you, sir. I'm going to make sure everybody who has a question gets an opportunity. We have folks over here, down here, all back here. Okay, go ahead. Ma'am?
Hi.
Hi.
We have an educational farm 8.5 miles from Ground Zero. My family history is, we've got a lot of cancer in our history. A huge catalyst for why we started farming the way that we do. So I guess my question to tie this in, since you pretty much all but guarantee don't buy anything from any farm within 30 miles, is what is, you know, when you're dealing with environmental law, no doubt you have to answer the question of ecology, of the terrain. Toxins are not just one, you know, individual thing, nor is health. Everything is ecological. Everything depends on the atmosphere that it's in, correct?
Right.
So surely you guys have dealt with this concept that not all soil responds the same and not all toxins travel the same given their environment. I would love for that to be addressed just personally for my peace of mind.
Sure.
That the ecology does matter. And I appreciate this woman who talked about detoxing because the terrain of our bodies matter. And the more practices you put into place of your land and your terrain to address these kinds of things that will continue to come into our lives. You know, I don't imagine that's going to help your case. I'd imagine the opposite team might be pressing into, well, what is the ecology? You know, but I would like it to be addressed publicly right now.
That is a great point because this is the circle of life, if you will, right? Water, air, soil, the biology, the critters, all of those things are intertwined. And one of the unfortunate things about this, and someone in your business, I'm assuming you probably don't use pesticides, you don't use herbicides for a reason, because there are toxins in those things that you want to keep out of the food that you raise. But unfortunately, now with this situation, with the toxins that are spread from this train derailment, the resultant fire and leakage, we don't have an option, right? They've been distributed and perhaps will continue to be distributed. Doctor, you have something to add about that in terms of the ecology of these releases and how that's all intertwined in the food chain, for instance?
Well, the question is right on. Certainly, ecology and differences in ecology in even relatively small areas are very important. I think one of the things important here is the monitoring of the contaminant levels in soils. I suspect that a lot of the soils, any distance, are probably not seriously contaminated. And remember, the plume had very specific directions. So residences and soils and farms under the plume need more attention than those that were not. But not everything is going to be so contaminated that you can't eat vegetables from your garden. I think that's the important. But I'm unhappy with government officials that say, oh, there's no problem, because I don't think we know that there's no problem. I think the problem is not likely to be as serious as many of you are worried about. But I would like to see rigorous, careful analysis with detection limits low enough so that you can detect any adverse exposure above what somebody 100 miles away from does not have. We are all exposed to chemicals all the time. There's no way, no matter how organic you operate your farm, there's no way you're not going to have some exposure from the fuels you use, the air that blows around. But we need to know when exposure as a result of this incident is greater than that in the background. And don't let anybody tell you it's safe when they don't have that evidence. But also don't fear that everything is so dangerous that you have to go out and give up. We need to get more accurate information before we panic, but we have to be skeptical when people say things like there's no problem when it isn't clear that there really is no problem.
Sure, and I think with respect to your particular business, my initial thought would be, listen, for you to assure your customers that things are okay, you might want to consider a battery of testing of the soil and water on your farm, right? You shouldn't have to pay for that, right? That should not be ultimately your responsibility. It may be good business for you to do that, to ensure your clients, customers, that things are fine. To the doctor's point, that proves, assuming the testing comes back, it's the appropriate testing, what have you. Those are the kinds of things on the individual side of how we represent our clients that we try to assess and determine, what kind of testing and analysis needs to be made in a general sense, so that we know, for instance, where all these contaminants went and what impact they have in a certain radius for everybody. But more importantly, for you, with an organic farm, it's your business and it's your livelihood. And so we would probably put together some sort of a testing plan and demand that Norfolk Southern pay for that ultimately, right? So these are things that have to happen sooner rather than later. You can't wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years to fully understand the impact on your business. And so that's why, we were on the scene within days, and we will be here until we resolve these issues for all of our clients. We got a question here, sir.
You said to contact our elected officials. I'm from Pennsylvania. Our elected official couldn't count his thumbs and come up with the same number twice. He's currently in a mental ward at Walter Reed Hospital, but he's the one that's supposed to be writing legislation for the railroad. And if you want to see what dioxin can do, research Times Beach, Missouri.
Yeah, well, and I get what you're saying. We
just wrote legislation with Casey, so he's still doing his job. Good.
Yeah. So, yeah, no, I mean, some obviously appointed officials, elected officials are more responsive than others, but it still is something that they need to understand, to hear from you, the impact on your life, your community, your children, grandchildren, et cetera, because that personalization ultimately, and Mr. Kennedy can back me up on here, there's nothing more motivating than a constituent and a voter who's outspoken and making sure that they're being heard. I'll get back to you, sir.
No, this is critical. This is a question that is probably, let me stand up. My question is I live within the 3-mile radius of the accident. Now, my question would be have they expanded the radius, for example, to that gentleman's question?
Right.
Columbiana is 10 miles from East Palestine. Now, since, I don't know if you gentlemen know the geography here, the neighboring towns are, in Ohio, it's Columbiana. If you go over to Pennsylvania, it's,
Union Valley.
Darlington and Chippewa. Now, my question would be is to, and I'll add to what this gentleman said, is that it's expanded to say 30 miles, let's say, okay? And I don't know, it would be conducive for all of us to encourage the people from Pennsylvania, the people from, you know, from say Darlington and Chippewa, and I don't know where you're from, Jim, sir, and also from Columbiana here, to get involved, and as this gentleman also said, is have those people go after their officials, because the more people we have going after, like you said, I agree with you, it's bullshit, it's completely bullshit, and the only thing, and I agree with you, is until we start putting pressure on these people, whether it's East Palestine, Chippewa, or Columbiana here, or Darlington, as he said, we're going to be screwed.
So if I can address that, our firm is currently working with a multitude of municipalities and counties to address issues that their elected officials, their commissioners, mayors, and council members are getting about the impact in their communities. And so one of the things we're looking at, I think that the doctor mentioned medical monitoring. Medical monitoring typically is for individuals, but there's also monitoring that may be necessary in the longer term in terms of water, soil, and air analysis. Those have to be fairly targeted. We have to have an understanding of how these pollutants migrate, whether it be by air, water, or otherwise. And so we're trying to put together some of those plans as well to better understand the scope of the physical impact of what happened here. And there are ways to narrow that down. I think the doctor alluded to that. We can't assume that every place is contaminated to the point of being unhealthy. And so we know that the EPA now is expanding some of their testing. They're not only where they're testing, but what they're testing for and to what levels. We need to encourage our elected officials to not skimp on that testing, because I think Mr. Kennedy alluded to this, your peace of mind and lack of peace of mind and the stress that comes with not knowing for sure if you're safe is compensable, right? And the reason it's compensable is that it matters. You need to know. We want to make sure we find out and understand, and we hold those people and companies accountable. I will mention, for the people who said they were from Pennsylvania, been in touch with the governor's office and the attorney general's office, spoke to the first deputy for attorney general for the state of Pennsylvania. And while I was speaking to him, their Department of Environmental Quality made a criminal referral to the Attorney General's office there. So my anticipation is that Norfolk Southern's executives are probably being investigated for criminal violations in the state of Pennsylvania. I've not heard that yet in Ohio, but I do know that Attorney General Yost sent a letter to Norfolk Southern telling them that they need to maintain and protect evidence because his office is looking in litigation, whether it be criminal or civil, I wouldn't know at this point. But sir, you had a question?
Thanks. This may tie into kind of what Mr. Kennedy was saying about our government agencies being captured, but this is a question I submitted on your website for the thing, but I'll just read it. As I'm sure you're aware, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services have toxicological profile reports on what seems like every chemical on Earth. Their report on vinyl chloride is a 293-page document. On page 5 of that document is the version history. What are your thoughts on, and is it just a crazy, strange coincidence that that document hadn't been touched, updated, or revised or anything since 2006, but it was just, for some strange reason, recently updated in January of 2023?
It is a strange coincidence.
East Coincidence, Ohio.
So it's a week before, after leaving it for 17 years, and what the CDC did is it changed the lethal exposure rate from 1 in 100 parts per million to 1 in 100,000 parts per million. And so it changed it from 1 in 100,000 parts per million to 1 in 100. So it reduced the exposure rate by 1,000 times. Why did they do this? I don't know why they did it. Usually those kind of changes take a couple of years of consideration before they do them. And as you say, there's almost a 300-page report. What I know it had to do with corruption. I promise you that is true, because that agency is corrupt from top to bottom. It's a septic tank of corruption. And I suspect what happened is that it was not in response to this particular, obviously it wasn't in response to this particular accident because it happened a week before. I think it's in response to this tremendous increase in vinyl chloride that we're seeing. That the industry went to CDC and said, we're going to have a lot of these problems and we better fix them in advance. And I think that's what happened. A lot of the cracking plants you see in this part of the country are driving the increase in plastic demand because they're creating waste products that they need to get rid of by putting them into the plastic industry. And so there's been a tremendous increase in the amount of vinyl chloride is being shipped, that is being handled, and I'm sure the vinyl chloride industry went to I suspect the vinyl chloride industry went to CDC and said we need reductions in this because we know it's going to cause us problems over the long run. And it increases the value of vinyl chloride.
Right.
If they can.
The timing of it is very crazy coincidence.
Yeah.
Pretty suspicious, but.
We have a question over here. Question over here, sir. Or who has the mic? Oh, there we go. Ask.
Hi, so from my understanding is the official manifest has actually never been released, right? They just have a spreadsheet. And if you compare the spreadsheet to an EPA report that came out around February 18th, there's already some conflicting information on it. But my question is, if they've never released the official manifest, what are they hiding and how do we actually know what to test for? I've seen no list of no one anywhere knows what should I get tested for, what should I test my soil for, what should I test my air for. I mean, just even a simple something for everybody normal.
So we are well along that process in getting discovery from this company to get the information, much of which they're withholding. And to your point, when the initial lawsuits were filed, we went to the court and we had the problems with Norfolk Southern were not allowing our experts to be in the field anywhere near the accident scene to do the kind of testing, not just on soil and water and air, but also to inspect the train cars and determine, whether there was faulty maintenance and other shortcuts that were made. And so we actually had to raise that issue with a federal judge in Youngstown, Ohio, and complain about it and have the judge tell Norfolk Southern they needed to cooperate with us. And so we are able to do these testing. We will get the manifest. We do know this. There were 50 cars derailed carrying 688,000 pounds of polyvinyl, and the good doctor here will know what these components are and tell us more about them. 273,000 pounds of ethyl hexyl arylate, 273,000 pounds of ethylene glycol monobutyl ether, 206,000 pounds of butyl acrylates, and then here's the kicker, it's 115,000 gallons, but it's is 1,109,000 pounds of vinyl chloride, which they burn, which turns itself, if it's not burned at high enough temperatures, to phosgene gas, all of which are extremely toxic to humans and others, right?
Phosgene gas was used to kill people in World War I as a chemical agent. So yes, it's very dangerous. Now, concentration here is not going to be like that, but it's not a trivial product of combustion.
And one of the questions that people have is, why did we have this conflagration of chemicals all in one train? And why was there a train with over 100 cars? You know, these are all questions that we're going to get answers to. And, you know, they have a cause and effect in this tragedy, obviously, but they also have policy implications that need to be addressed at every level. And most particular because it's interstate transport at the federal level. Do you have a follow-up, ma'am?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up, sir. I guess, would it be, you know, people are concerned, what, is it, should we have vertical gardens this year? I mean, because people are concerned about the rain. I mean, I'm concerned about the rain in my soil and my gardens. And then, just a follow-up, I actually am from Pennsylvania, and I have been talking to local officials, but really put the pressure on county commissioners as well, because they get federal money for public health, and this is the biggest public health scare around here ever. So do not forget about your commissioners. They get skipped out on a lot.
So I'm going to try to address the issue about the future as it relates to rain, and I'm going to have the doctor be my conscience here. The airborne contaminants, for the most part, I believe, have stopped, except for wind-blown, something that may already be in the soil, that might be wind-blown later. We still have an issue with the contaminant plume in the water. I saw pictures this morning of, because of the precipitation that we've received, there's water backing up and runoff from the site that potentially gets into both surface and underground water systems. You want to address that in terms of, is there an issue with further contaminants coming out of the air with rain?
No, I think that issue is pretty well over. The problem is these contaminants can bind to particulates. Now, when you have a fire, you always get soot. That's what we're talking about is particulates. And some of these organic chemicals will bind to that. Now, soot will settle with time, but it can also be redistributed into the air by wind and that sort of thing. So with time, the new exposure via the air is going to go down, but there's going to be contamination on the soil from the settling of the soot. It's going to take volatile organics that can come off of it again.
Where are we at with the microphone? Okay, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question.
You bet.
To the good doctor, with the onset of spring, it's a beautiful sunny day, I went to mow my lawn. In doing so, am I going to re-agitate the chemicals that's laying on top of my grass? And subsequent to that, once I do re-agitate them and they settle back down, what happens to the following time that I cut my grass? Am I going to re-agitate those same chemicals and make them airborne?
So the question is, mowing his lawn, whether he's going to re-agitate anything that may have settled out of the air. The first question is whether the air plume, if you will, whether any of those airborne contaminants ever even made it to your lawn, right? And that's a question I don't know the answer to at this point. But if you assume that you were in close proximity and the plume from the burn settled on your property, then there might be an issue.
Well, there's almost no question that you would resuspend some of those contaminants, but it would be much less than you had earlier. So I don't think that's a reason to not mow your lawn. That's what I'm saying. Now, rain on the lawn is going to cause them to go down and more in the soil. So yes, there's some possibility, but it's not a major one.
close to the end, aren't we?
Yeah, I have a question here that's been wanting to ask for you guys. I don't know if you've touched on this or not yet. How safe is the water currently? How long do they need to test for, and how often?
Again, a lot of this depends on location, right? Waterborne contaminants can travel not only in surface water, but underground as well. There will be an immediate impact, even after the cleanup of the wastes that are being hauled off at the site itself. And one of the big issues will be putting on monitoring systems, wells and whatnot, to determine the size of the plume, the migration of contaminants, the water in general. And that's a more immediate to the site kind of a thing. The airborne contaminants, which are much more diffused and not in greater quantities, correct? A lot of that, again, depends on which direction the air was blowing on the day that these things were burning. You want to add anything to that?
I would just add the obvious that everybody probably understands is that the the worst contamination is going to be in the creeks and streams that are down grade from the crash site. And, there's already been, I think, 43,000 animals that have died, mainly fish, but also deer, foxes, raccoon. There's only been a few necropsies done, but, that is, in my experience, that contamination is likely to last for many, many years. I would not go fishing in that creek or be recreating in that creek for years and years. Those kinds of chemicals can lodge in the soil, in the mud, and they can stay there. And when you stir it up, you're resuspending them. Oh.
Yeah, Doctor, good there?
No, that's absolutely correct. They can stay in they bind to these sediments in soot. It goes into the water, it pretty much settles and becomes part of the sediment. And if every time it's disturbed, it's going to be reactivated into the stream.
Now, some toxins will degrade themselves over time, correct? And be less toxic, if you will. Others have a half-life of a long time, correct?
Yeah, this is correct, and that's why we're so concerned about dioxin. Dioxin half-life, if you ate a contaminated Big Mac last night, you'll have half of those dioxins in your body in 7 to 10 years from now. If it's benzene or vinyl chloride, pure vinyl chloride, those are metabolized in the human body in a matter of days. But in the environment, they can stay bound to sediments, or more dangerously, get into the groundwater and migrate in the groundwater way downstream from where the original contamination occurred. That's a problem.
Are they cumulative?
Dioxin is cumulative, vinyl chloride is not.
Great question, by the way.
I'd just like to ask a medical question, and it's a very serious one. As soon as I heard about the East Palestine explosion, I was reminded of the BP oil spill. I was in Florida at that time, and I was an reporter down in the Gulf with a bunch of people in the Gulf of Mexico. And one of the things that they could not find, and I cannot find here, and I went to Mercy Hospital, I went to Southwoods, and now I'm going to Cleveland Clinic to find out what tests are necessary. All right, nobody seems to know. None of the people in the major medical institutions in our area are equipped for this. And they need, my concern is, somebody somewhere should give them kind of a template. What do we test for? Because I was told you need referrals. Well, if you need referrals for these tests, where do you get the referrals? And it's like a mouse chasing its tail. They don't know. They need to know.
So, to the issue, Doctor, of Naniquilmod, there's been discussion by others about getting baseline blood tests, for instance, or a baseline physical. Are those things that individuals who have concerns about having been exposed to airborne, waterborne, soil-borne toxins, should they consider doing, and how do they go about doing it if they can't get a referral? Can you just walk into a clinic and say, I want to get a blood test? How do you deal with that?
No, that's a problem. You know, unless you have your personal physician, I'm not very supportive of just everybody running and trying to get a physical exam, because it may be valuable if you can show that you don't have cancer today, but you have it in 10 years from now. But to monitor for these chemicals is also very difficult. First of all, if you get a blood test, what are you going to analyze it for? Most of these volatile organics, you can't measure them in the blood, but you can measure them by breakdown products in the urine. But, you know, that should have been done 2 weeks ago, after there was high level of exposure.
So in some circumstances with our clients that we represent, we do that by baseline work. I won't say that in every case we do that here, but we do have our clients see a physician and get specific testing done. Depends on the circumstances, et cetera. Again, we wouldn't do it with everybody probably, but that's a really great question. And, you know, and really what it boils down to is the peace of mind and knowing, am I okay? Am I gonna be okay, right? It's a very difficult thing to ascertain in the near term, as the doctor mentioned. For some of these things, they only would have showed up in probably the first couple of weeks of being exposed. But again, these diaries and writing down your experiences, your symptoms, and how you're feeling is very, very important. Writing down where you were when this happened is very, very important, because we can pinpoint where you may have been in relation to things like airborne contaminants, waterborne contaminants, etc. Anything to add there? Is that, am I speaking out of turn, Doctor?
No, you're speaking right on. That's
I've
quite
got
accurate.
this isn't my first rodeo, as they say in Montana. So, any other, you know, we're winding down here. Let me just say this before everybody leaves. There's contact information on this sheet. There's a phone number. If you choose to be represented, that's totally up to you. If you feel like you need to talk to an attorney, we would encourage you to do that. It doesn't have to be us. If you need to see a physician, please do. Begin your diary so that we can help, others can help you substantiate down the road whether you were exposed and whether or not you may or may not have a claim. Last question.
Last question. Let's do 3 more. I saw 2 more hands after this. Okay?
Okay.
Sorry for asking so many questions. I really want to put, I guess, the people on the spot here. I know a lot of people are from East Palestine or the neighboring areas. And I guess my question is, do you feel that when they do the cleanup, it's going to be safe to live here, or do we need to, again, this is up to all the individuals here, but should we consider possibly moving out of the area?
Yeah, so that's a difficult question, and it's highly personable. But in terms of how our firm would expect to hold Norfolk Southern accountable now and in the future would be that things need to be put back in a better situation than they were when they caused this accident. Whether or not how that might be done, some people have talked about Norfolk Southern buying their property, their home or whatever, because they're afraid the values will go down. Nobody's going to be interested in buying their home, those kinds of things. All of that's going to need to be sorted out. But ultimately, our goal is to make sure that every adverse impact caused by Norfolk Southern's negligence needs to be addressed. And it needs to be addressed on an individual basis for each and every person who was personally impacted. It needs to be addressed on a business basis for every business that was impacted. It needs to be addressed on a community basis, every community, and so on and so forth. And the ultimate goal, aside from addressing the very real issues and problems and claims of people now in this area, is that there has to be a change in how these companies operate. And that's part of what we do too. We do it in court. And we do it with individuals like Mr. Kennedy and the good doctor and others who know the facts and can bring the information to bear to change policies so that no one else has to go through this in the future. So I think we've got as much as we can do here today. Let me close again by saying I come from a small community, little town in eastern Montana where I grew up, and there is not only comfort in numbers, but there's force in numbers, and folks need to speak out about this situation. And we all need to do it in a diplomatic but forceful and persuasive way to make sure that Norfolk Southern is held accountable and its executives and anyone else who may be responsible, and that there's change down the road. We at Morgan & Morgan really appreciate your time, and we hope and pray that we can address these issues in the very best way, not just for our clients, but for the communities and the people in this area for many years to come. So thank you again for being here, Doctor. Thank you. And please stay safe. And if you have further questions, you can use the phone number and the contact information that you see here. You can go to our website at www.forthepeople.com. Forthepeople.com. Thank you again, and God bless.
Thank you.